In January of 2012, a police truck parked on a trail in Griffith Park in Los Angeles, California. A member of the canine unit opened the door, and a police dog named Indiana Bones jumped out. Indy quickly caught a scent and led his handler to a mound of dirt just off the path. Indy pawed at the dirt and suddenly revealed the top of a plastic bag. The dog's handler reached into the dirt and pulled out the bag, and when she looked inside, she saw 2 dismembered human feet and a hand. Indy's discovery would launch an investigation that would lead 2 LA detectives into the most insane case they'd ever worked, a case that would involve everything from Mexican drug cartels to a Canadian cannibal. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button goes camping, wait for them to go to bed for the night, at which point light and then throw a Yon Shakaduma firework onto their tent. On Christmas Day 2011, 67-year-old Hervey Medellin turned off the oven in his apartment in Hollywood, California, opened up the oven door, and pulled out a casserole dish covered with foil. Hervey looked up at the clock and smiled, because his friend, who was coming over for a holiday visit, would be there any minute, and the food he was making had finished cooking at exactly the right time. He turned down the radio playing Christmas music in the kitchen and called out to his roommate, Gabriel Martinez, and told him lunch was almost ready. Gabriel had his eyes glued to his laptop, totally engrossed in whatever it was he was doing, and so he just gave Hervey a sort of grunt of acknowledgement. Hervey responded with an irritated sigh. Gabriel, who was 30 years younger than Hervey, had been spending so much time online lately that he barely connected with the world around him. Hervey realized it was very likely a generational thing, but he didn't understand why anyone would want to spend so much time just staring at a computer screen. But Hervey refused to be bothered by Gabriel today. It was Christmas, and Christmas was a time for joy, friends, and good food. Hervey set down the hot casserole dish on the table in the small dining area, and he looked around with satisfaction at all the Christmas decorations he had spent hours hanging up. Hervey's entire one-bedroom apartment now looked like it had been decorated by a professional interior designer. But perhaps the most impressive part of the decorations was not actually the Christmas stuff. It was the paintings that were hanging on the walls. These were not paintings that would be found in most small one-bedroom apartments. These were original works by famous artists. Just then, the doorbell rang, interrupting Hervey's thoughts, and Hervey removed his oven mitts and went to open the door. And when he did, he saw his friend Amelia standing there, holding several wrapped presents. Hervey grinned and said Merry Christmas and gave Amelia a big hug. Then he let her inside and told her to put the presents down because before they got to presents and to food, he had to show her something. Amelia put down the presents, said hello to Gabriel, and then Hervey took her hand and led her across the front room. Then Hervey pointed to a painting hanging on the wall, and he could hear Amelia gasp. She turned to Hervey almost in disbelief and asked if it was an original. Hervey smiled and nodded. He said the last time he'd gone down to Mexico, where he was originally from, he had acquired this painting, which was an original work of art by Diego Rivera, one of the most famous Mexican painters to have ever lived. After staring at this painting with his friend for several minutes, Hervey said it was time to go eat. He told Gabriel to put his computer away for a while and join them, and then the 3 of them headed to the table and dug into the casserole Hervey had prepared. While they ate, Hervey told Amelia more about his latest trip to Mexico and also about the travel plans he was making to destinations all over the world. Hervey said sometimes he still couldn't believe this was actually his real life. He'd worked so hard from the moment he came to the United States as a young man, with the hope that one day he'd be able to do whatever he wanted. And now he felt like he'd accomplished that. He was retired and filling his days with adventure and art. Hervey, Amelia, and Gabriel spent the day eating, talking, laughing, and exchanging gifts. For Hervey, who had spent most of his life far away from his family, this really felt like the perfect holiday. And other than maybe traveling, he couldn't imagine a better way to spend his time than eating delicious food and catching up with friends. By late afternoon, Amelia said unfortunately she had to go home, so Hervey walked her to the door. He gave her another big hug, wished her Merry Christmas again, and said he couldn't wait to get together with her in the new year. More than 3 weeks later, on the morning of Tuesday, January 17th, a dog walker named Lauren Kornberg left her house with her mother and 9 dogs. They headed toward their usual hiking path, which cut through an area called Bronson Canyon. Bronson Canyon is located inside of Griffith Park, which is basically LA's equivalent to New York's Central Park, but it sits high above the city. It was the perfect winter morning in Los Angeles, which meant it was a crisp 50 degrees and the Hollywood Hills were bathed in soft orange sunlight. So Lauren and her mom took the dogs up a side path that branched out from the main hiking trail, and once they were far enough away from other hikers, they let the dogs off leash. And as soon as that happened, the dogs instantly began playfully running around together, but one of them, a golden retriever, broke away from the pack and wandered over toward a bushy area next to a shallow ravine off the side of the path. And this golden retriever began digging in this one area of the brush. Lauren watched as the retriever pulled out a plastic bag from the brush and then began sniffing it. And as the dog began to sort of vigorously paw at this bag, a large round object suddenly rolled out of it and began tumbling down into the ravine. 2 other dogs from the group, a husky and a small terrier, ran down the ravine after this big round object. And Lauren's mom asked what had just rolled out of the bag. Lauren said she didn't know, but it sort of looked like a movie prop, which wouldn't actually be an unusual thing to find lying around, because there were Hollywood special effects and prop houses not too far from here, and many movies and TV shows were filmed in this area. Lauren's mom walked over toward the ravine to try to get a better look at this movie prop, but as she got close to the edge, she looked down and saw that the dogs were no longer playing. In fact, the terrier was backing away from this object with its hair up, like the dog was terrified. And so Lauren, she kind of leaned forward and looked as best as she could to see what this object was. And suddenly, when one of the dogs stepped out of the way, she had a clear line of sight onto this object. And when she saw what it was, she began backing away too, because the object was no prop. It was a real severed human head. About an hour later, helicopters loudly hovered over the canyon and police blocked access to the entire area, as more than a dozen LAPD cruisers, CSI units, and news vans parked along the nearby scenic overlook. Detective Chuck Knowles and his partner, Detective Lisa Sanchez, walked up the trail and met with the uniformed officers who had cordoned off the area with police tape. By this point, crime scene investigators had retrieved the severed head from the ravine and brought it onto the trail. When Detective Sanchez walked over to them and saw the severed head, her stomach churned. She had investigated her fair share of murder cases, but this was the first time she dealt with any kind of dismemberment. As Sanchez began to study the head, one of the uniformed officers walked up to her and told her that the 2 women who actually found the head at first thought it was fake. They thought it was a movie prop. Detective Sanchez could understand why, because there was very little decomposition, and the head was so fresh and pristine that it looked like it had just been removed. From the looks of it, Sanchez believed the head belonged to a man who could be in his 60s, but that was about all she could guess about the victim at this point. So police began fanning out and searching the area, hoping to find some more clues. More helicopters and search units began to pour into the area, and the search expanded to a 7-acre radius. Searchers began entering backyards of the homes in the area, and some of these homes were really expensive houses that belonged to famous movie stars, so the police knew this case was going to draw even more media attention. Around 4:30 p.m., the sun began to set, and despite an exhaustive search of the area, no further human remains turned up. So the searchers left their equipment, kept the area cordoned off, and went home for the night. That evening, reports of the dismembered body found in Griffith Park were all over local news stations. And although violent crime in LA was far from rare, violent crime in this particular neighborhood in Bronson Canyon was almost unheard of. The people who lived in the neighborhood, who were willing to talk on camera, were shocked that something like this could happen just beyond their backyards. People who had been hiking and walking their dogs in Bronson Canyon for years told reporters they were now afraid to step foot on the hiking paths until the killer or killers were apprehended. The following day, LAPD returned to Bronson Canyon and performed a highly organized grid search, scouring the area where the head had turned up. The police were already feeling pressure from the media, city leaders, and local residents to find the people or person who had committed this horrific crime. But Detectives Knowles and Sanchez knew there was still so much physical area to cover and search, and they still had no idea who the victim even was. So this just didn't seem like a case they could just wrap up in a couple of days. And by late morning, the searchers had still found nothing new when a police truck pulled up and a dog handler stepped out with her cadaver dog, a German Shepherd named Indiana Bones, who was famous for being the first four-legged detective on LA County Coroner's team. After getting out of the car, Indy's handler began leading the dog up a nearby hill, and almost immediately as they began to walk, Indy pulled the handler in the direction of this nearby dirt mound. The handler walked over to the mound and, with a gloved hand, began pushing the dirt aside, revealing what looked like a shallow grave. And in this shallow grave was a plastic bag. The handler reached her hands down and carefully cupped them beneath the bag and gently pulled it out of the ground. Then she took a pair of scissors out of her pocket, cut the bag open, and looked inside. And inside, she saw a pair of human feet and a hand. The next morning, Detective Knowles and Sanchez sat at their computers, sifting through recent missing person reports. The victim's torso, or any more of his body, still had not been found. But the detectives hoped that the feet and hand that were found also belonged to their victim, and that with these new body parts, they might be able to connect their victim to somebody who went missing in the area. Just then, the sound of a fax machine broke their focus. Knowles stood up, tore the paper off the machine, and saw that the medical examiner had completed his examination on the severed hand, feet, and head. Knowles scanned the whole report and then read aloud the important parts to Sanchez. The medical examiner had confirmed that all those body parts belonged to the same victim. Also, they said that after the victim was dead, his killer carefully cut apart the man's body, right at the joints in a very precise manner. So whoever cut the body up seemed to really know what they were doing. But what was even more intriguing was that the body parts had been refrigerated before they were dumped, which explained why the head had looked so fresh when it was found. But this made it difficult for the medical examiner to pin down exactly when the victim was killed. However, because the parts were so fresh, the examiner was able to lift very clear fingerprints from the man's fingers. And when he ran those prints through a system, he got a hit. The dismembered man was Hervé Medellin. Knowles sat down at his computer and ran Hervé's name through every database he had access to. And he quickly learned that Hervé had been reported missing just a day before his head was found. The missing persons report had been filed by a man named Gabriel Martinez, who said he was Hervé's roommate. So Detective Knowles and Sanchez got into their car and began driving towards Hervé's apartment, which happened to be just 2 blocks away from the Hollywood police station. While they were in the car, Knowles and Sanchez discussed their game plan for when they talked to this roommate. And their plan was simple: reveal nothing. Although news of the grisly discovery was already all over town, that victim's identity had not yet been released by the media. Only the police knew that information. And so they wanted to feel out what Hervé's roommate knew and didn't know. He was not a suspect yet, but he was definitely a person of interest. The detectives parked at the curb and walked up to Hervé's building. It was this elegantly plain, narrow building constructed in the 1920s that felt totally vintage and old Hollywood. The detectives walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor, to apartment 319, and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened and a dark-haired man in his 30s greeted the detectives. They introduced themselves and asked if he was Gabriel Martinez. Gabriel said yes, and then asked immediately if they had news about Hervé. Had they found him? Was he okay? The detectives exchanged a quick glance, and then Sanchez said they were still investigating Hervé's disappearance. And for now, they just needed to speak to Gabriel to try to help with that case. Gabriel suddenly went from being sort of hopeful to looking pretty concerned, but then told them he was glad to tell them anything they wanted, and he asked them to come inside. Once inside, they all sat down at the table in the small dining area. Detective Knowles asked Gabriel when he'd last seen Hervé, and Gabriel said not since shortly after Christmas, on December 27th. That's when Hervé had gone to Mexico. It was where he grew up and where he still had friends and family. Gabriel said that Hervé traveled internationally a lot, and sometimes he would go on these open-ended trips. so Gabriel was not always exactly sure when Hervey was going to come home again. But Hervey had been calling pretty regularly just to check in, and then suddenly the call stopped. So Gabriel started to get really worried and then eventually filed the missing person report. Detective Sanchez asked Gabriel if he had called or texted Hervey after Hervey stopped calling, just to see if maybe he was staying in Mexico longer. Gabriel said he hadn't, but he explained that Hervey had actually left his cell phone behind at the apartment because he didn't get service in Mexico. Now, Gabriel knew there were ways around that, but he said discussing technology with Hervey was usually a losing cause. Hervey just preferred to use a landline and an international calling card whenever he was in Mexico. Sanchez asked if there was a record of these calls from Hervey, and Gabriel said yes, and he grabbed his phone and showed the detectives the calls he'd received from Hervey in January. The detectives saw that these calls were from an international calling card number, which meant they didn't actually know who placed those calls, but it did corroborate what Gabriel had told them. The detectives would talk to Gabriel for a bit longer, but the whole time they stuck to their original plan. They didn't reveal anything about Hervey's murder. Back at the station, Detective Knowles and Sanchez went over what they had so far, and they agreed it was not very much. And what little they did have didn't quite add up. And it really had to do with this trip to Mexico they had just learned about. Did Hervey really go to Mexico and then get murdered and dismembered there? And then his body parts were shipped back to LA and dumped in LA? Or did Hervey come back from Mexico in one piece and then somehow get intercepted before he got home by somebody who then murdered, dismembered, and dumped him? Both these theories just seemed like they were missing something. Like, did Hervey really even go to Mexico? They didn't know. I mean, regardless of what Hervey's roommate Gabriel had told them, the detectives thought it actually made a whole lot more sense that somebody would have killed and dismembered Hervey right there in his own apartment and disposed of him in nearby Griffith Park, which certainly made Gabriel seem very suspicious. The following day, which is now 3 days after Hervey's head had been found, the detectives returned to Hervey's apartment, and this time they showed up with a search warrant, a team of police, and cadaver dogs. Once inside, they let the dogs loose, and the dogs began frantically sniffing around the floorboards, the furniture, and the corners of every room. Meanwhile, Gabriel sat at the table and watched in silence as the investigators practically tore up the tiny one-bedroom apartment. The search team rifled through drawers and closets, they confiscated computers and phones, and they photographed every item inside the apartment. But at the end of the search, they realized they had found absolutely nothing. There was no blood, no hidden torso, no bone saws or other dismemberment tools, and so this apartment just didn't appear to be the place where the murder or dismemberment or both took place. As the search team began to leave the apartment, Detectives Knowles and Sanchez sat down at the table with Gabriel. And Gabriel didn't look angry or raise his voice, but he wanted to know, what had changed since they spoke a day earlier that made the detectives feel like they could come into his and Hervey's home and tear it apart like this. Sanchez whispered something to Knowles, and then she finally broke the news to Gabriel. Those body parts that were found in the canyon that were all over the news belonged to Hervey. Hervey was deceased, and so now Hervey's death was being investigated as a homicide. Immediately, all the color drained from Gabriel's face. He said he couldn't believe it. This didn't seem real. Now, the detectives understood how upsetting this was for Gabriel, but they needed more information. So they pressed Gabriel for more details about Hervey's trip to Mexico. And so, for the next half hour, Gabriel, despite being in shock, was cooperative and answered every question and tried to give detectives any information at all that could be useful. Later that day, the two detectives returned to the station and went into an evidence room where everything collected from Hervey's apartment was laid out on a table. One of the evidence technicians in the room told the detectives that he happened to look at the photos taken of the apartment, and some of the victims' artwork hung on the walls was worth a ton of money. The Diego Rivera painting alone was likely worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, this struck the detectives as being really odd. According to the information Gabriel had provided, and based on what the detectives had learned from their databases, Hervey was a retiree, living on a small pension in a small one-bedroom apartment. So how was he also a serious art collector able to acquire paintings that were potentially worth a small fortune. The following day, so now 4 days after Hervey's head was discovered, a call came through to Knowles' desk. The man on the other end introduced himself as a retired LAPD narcotics detective, and this retired detective said he'd been reading the newspaper that morning and happened to see that the dismembered victim from Griffith Park had been identified. And when he saw the name, Hervey Medellin, it immediately rang a bell. He said back in the early 1990s, when he was investigating a Mexican drug cartel, Hervey's name had come up in the investigation. And in fact, he had interviewed Hervey a couple of times. Knowles kept listening, but right away his mind began to race. A connection to Mexican cartels and drug trafficking could maybe explain how Hervey had enough cash to buy those famous paintings. The retired detective explained that Hervey had worked as a ticket taker for Mexicana Airlines. At that time, that airline was believed to have been used for drug smuggling. And Hervey had become a kind of personal concierge for the wives and girlfriends of drug cartel members. When these women would visit LA, Hervey would book their hotel rooms, arrange shopping trips, and give them dining recommendations. Now, none of that was illegal, so the narcotics detective had no reason to pursue Hervey. He ultimately just kind of became a minor character in a much bigger investigation. But now that this former detective found out that Hervey had turned up dead and dismembered, he wondered if maybe Hervey's connection to the drug cartels had gone much deeper than he realized. As Knowles listened, he was having the same type of thoughts. Was Hervey a drug mule? Were those paintings a form of payment from the cartels? Did Hervey fail to repay a debt, and did the cartel brutally murder him for it? After all, some Mexican cartels were known to behead and dismember some of their victims. Knowles thanked the retired detective for reaching out to him. He hung up and passed this new information along to his partner Sanchez. The detectives now realized they could be in over their heads. Poking the hornet's nest with a Mexican drug cartel is the kind of thing that gets people killed, even cops. Over the next week, Knowles and Sanchez started to pursue this new lead, but they quickly discovered that a potential run-in with a violent Mexican drug cartel was actually not the biggest issue they were facing. Instead, the big issue that kept setting them back was just old-fashioned bureaucracy. Getting Mexican law enforcement agencies to cooperate in any investigation was never really easy, but when the investigation involved the cartels, it seemed almost impossible. Mexican authorities weren't eager to anger the cartels or possibly jeopardize their own investigations into the drug trade just to assist LA cops on a homicide case. And when Knowles and Sanchez turned to federal law enforcement agencies in the United States, they ran into similar problems. The DEA and the FBI were running multiple investigations involving the cartels, and they could not put those at risk just because Hervey had been interviewed by a narcotics cop over 20 years ago. But the FBI did at least tell Knowles and Sanchez that they would dig into Hervey's financial records to see if he had a clear connection to the cartels before he was killed. In the meantime, the feds told the LA detectives to go ahead and stay away from the cartel stuff and just let them handle that. They should just focus on leads that were in the United States. Now, Knowles and Sanchez understood why the feds reacted that way, but they still felt like a huge lead, i.e. going after the cartels, had just been yanked out from under them. On top of that, the FBI had no reason to expedite finding these financial records because this was not their case, so there was no telling how long it would actually take the feds to provide them with any information. Feeling frustrated and a bit lost on what to do next, Knowles and Sanchez turned their focus back to the victim. The detectives reached out to Hervey's LA friends to learn more about who Hervey was. And the picture that began to emerge of Hervey was of a warm, friendly guy who had moved to LA from Mexico as a young man, who had worked hard and was now enjoying his retirement and living the American dream that he had always believed in. Now, Knowles and Sanchez didn't think any of this information really helped their case, and none of it seemed to make Hervey look like a guy who had deep ties to the drug trafficking world. The detectives would still need to hear back from the FBI, but if Hervey had been working with a cartel, he'd managed to keep it pretty secret. So the detectives just kept pushing forward, talking to everyone they could who knew Hervey. And finally, just when they felt like they were running out of people to interview, the detectives did learn something very interesting. Hervey's roommate, Gabriel, was not just his roommate. Gabriel was Hervey's boyfriend. Now, Gabriel had not told the detectives this, and they couldn't believe that he had kept this a secret across the 2 interviews they had done with him. Having an intimate relationship with the victim immediately put Gabriel at the top of the suspect list, and the fact that he had lied about the relationship made him look even more suspicious. So, Knowles and Sanchez called Gabriel into the station for another interview. But when they confronted him, instead of him getting defensive or trying to deny it, Gabriel readily admitted that he and Hervey were indeed in a relationship. He told the detectives he was just a very private person and felt uncomfortable sharing those kinds of details. Sanchez and Knowles did not believe Gabriel, and they told him that because he had hid this information, they felt like he could be hiding something else. But Gabriel insisted he wasn't hiding anything. And then without any further prompting, he opened up about his and Hervey's relationship. Gabriel told them all about how he and Hervey had met, how at first they were good friends, and then they fell in love and moved in together. And after several minutes of this, when the detectives were finally able to steer the conversation back to the weeks leading up to the murder, Gabriel's story about Hervey's trip to Mexico and the phone calls he got didn't change at all. By the end of the interview, Knowles and Sanchez really didn't know what to think. Gabriel had clearly held back information from them about the relationship with Hervey, but when confronted, he told them all about it and then hadn't changed or embellished his story at all from that point forward. And also, they had already searched the apartment and there was no evidence that connected Gabriel to the crime. Not long after this meeting, things only seemed to get worse for the 2 detectives. The FBI came back to them and told them that after doing some digging, they found that Hervey's financial records did not show any connection to any drug cartels, or any other known criminals for that matter. Now, they still couldn't completely rule out the cartel's involvement in this murder, but for now at least, this lead felt like a dead end. By mid-April, so 3 months after Hervey's head had been found, the LAPD finally released Hervey's remains to his family so they could have a proper funeral. Knowles and Sanchez couldn't help but feel like they had let Hervey and his family down. They were no closer to finding the killer or killers than they had been on day 1 of the investigation. And in the weeks following the funeral, Knowles and Sanchez started to get assigned new cases that required immediate action. Hervey's murder was slowly becoming a cold case. Until one day in June, so now 5 months after Hervey's head had been found, Detective Knowles' phone rang, and he had one of the most bizarre conversations he'd had in all his time working in homicide. The caller introduced himself as an investigator with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. For a second, Knowles thought somebody might be prank calling him, because it was not every day an LA detective gets a call from a Canadian Mountie. But the Mountie quickly told Knowles that he'd been made aware of the case from back in January with the severed head and limbs. And the Mountie said they had actually just had a very similar case up in Quebec. A video had been uploaded to the internet that showed this naked man tied to a bed and another individual, dressed all in black, repeatedly stabbing him with an ice pick. And then once the man was dead, the killer dismembered the body before sexually abusing the body and cannibalizing some parts of it. And as if that wasn't brutal enough, the killer then sent other parts of the body to members of Canadian Parliament and several different elementary schools. Detective Knowles just sat there on the phone in silence. I mean, this was a totally brutal and horrible story, but he couldn't see any real connection to Hervey's murder, aside from both victims having been dismembered. But the Mountie continued and said they had actually already arrested this internet killer. And this man, who was a Canadian citizen named Luca Magnotta, was obsessed with Hollywood. He had recently lived in Los Angeles, not far from where Hervey lived, where he acted in porn movies and worked as a male escort before going back to Canada. But the big thing, the real reason the Mountie had called Knowles in the first place, was that while Luca was living in Los Angeles, he kept a blog in which he wrote about his exploits. And one of the things he wrote about was the dismembered body found in Bronson Canyon. Hervey's body. After the call with the Mountie, Knowles quickly met with Sanchez, and the detectives decided the first thing they needed to do was figure out exactly when Luca had been in the United States to see if maybe he could have actually crossed paths with Hervey in late December or January, the time they believed Hervey was killed. They reached out to the agencies in the US and Canada that maintain customs data, and they were able to find out when Luca actually crossed the border into the US and when he went back into Canada. Then they dug into Hervey's customs data to try to nail down the exact time he traveled to Mexico and if and when he came back to the States, in order to see if he and Luca had been in LA at the same time. But while they were looking into this, they discovered something that totally shocked them and made them rethink everything about this investigation. They came to realize that the reason the case had stalled out was because they had been operating under a false assumption the whole time. And after making this huge discovery, Knowles and Sanchez believed they had finally cracked the case. Based on all the evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Hervey Medellin. At around 3 a.m. on December 27, 2011, the killer crept through Hervey's apartment to the bedroom. The door was cracked open, and the killer looked in and saw Hervey sleeping inside. The killer threw the door open, rushed the bed, and jumped on top of him. Hervey immediately woke up and began yelling as the killer tried to cup their hands over Hervey's mouth to muffle his screams. Hervey kept fighting back, but the killer wrapped their hands around his throat and began to squeeze. Hervey continued to yell, so the killer squeezed harder and harder, and after about 5 minutes of this, Hervey stopped struggling. His face was blue and his eyes were empty. He was dead. The killer remained in Hervey's apartment, and a bit later that morning, they opened up Gabriel's computer and did a search. They pulled up an article titled "Butchering the Human Carcass for Consumption." This article provided detailed instructions on how to dismember a human body for the purpose of cooking and consuming it. Once the killer felt like they had a clear understanding of what to do, they went back to Hervey's bedroom and used a saw they had recently purchased to separate Hervey's head and limbs from his body. The killer then refrigerated those body parts for 3 weeks, but for reasons no one fully understands, the killer never actually consumed any of it. There was no cannibalism, despite clearly there being some level of interest based on that search that was done on Gabriel's computer on the night of the murder. And so 3 weeks after the murder, the killer walked through Bronson Canyon in the dark with Hervey's body parts and dug shallow graves at various spots and buried them. And soon after that, with Hervey now officially out of the picture, the killer was able to transfer all the money from Hervey's personal bank account into the joint bank account they had opened after they had moved in together. Gabriel Martinez murdered his boyfriend Hervey in the apartment they shared. It turned out that before Christmas of 2011, Gabriel and Hervey's relationship had started to completely fall apart. In fact, things had gotten so bad that Hervey told Gabriel he wanted to end things, and he said Gabriel should start looking for another place to live. Gabriel knew he would not be able to afford a Los Angeles apartment or lead the life he'd grown accustomed to on his own because he didn't have a steady income. He had become financially dependent on Hervey, and so, in his desperation, he had decided to kill Hervey and steal his money. On Christmas Day, when Hervey's friend Amelia came over, Gabriel sat on the couch with his laptop, Googling what tools to use to cut up a human body. Being Hervey's significant other and failing to disclose their relationship to police had made Gabriel a leading suspect early on, but police had found no clear evidence pointing to Gabriel or anyone else, so the case had gone cold. But it was the customs data that detectives obtained while following the lead on the Canadian internet killer, Luca Magnotta, that helped lead them back to Gabriel. Customs data showed that Luca had been in Canada at the time Hervey went missing, which ruled Luca out as the killer. But more importantly, this customs data made it clear that Hervey had never actually traveled or even booked a flight to Mexico at any time in late December or January. Gabriel had crafted this intricate lie about Hervey's trip, even providing phone records showing all the times Hervey had called him from Mexico. But once investigators knew Gabriel was lying, they dug deeper into his phone records and discovered the calls had actually come from Herbie's friend, who was calling Gabriel from Mexico, but they were doing so to find out why they had suddenly stopped hearing from Herbie. At this point, the detectives were sure Gabriel was the killer. But the final piece of evidence they would need to convince the district attorney would not be discovered until 2014, over 2 years after the murder. At that time, a city worker was digging in the ground not too far from where Herbie's head had been discovered, and he found a plastic bag containing pieces of decaying human flesh. A DNA sample of this flesh matched Herbie's DNA, but it was actually the bag itself that sealed Herbie's case. Because this was a very specific type of bag, one that was used to protect and transport expensive paintings. And it matched those same types of bags that had been found in Hervey and Gabriel's apartment. Los Angeles detectives tracked Gabriel down in San Antonio, Texas, where he had married a wealthy woman who was supporting him, and with the help of local police, they arrested him. Gabriel was eventually found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. In 1909, Ioana Constantinescu was a 27-year-old woman living in the Romanian city of Timișoara. Ioana was a devout practitioner of Zoroastrianism, which is one of the world's oldest organized religions that began in ancient Persia and is now practiced primarily in East Asia. In the city that Ioana was living in, it was majority Christian, and they looked at Zoroastrians as witches. As such, Ioana was persecuted and ostracized primarily by these 2 Christian ministers that spread a rumor that she was drinking the blood of local children and that she worshipped Satan. That rumor would spread and grow to the point where everybody knew Ioana as like the singular witch of all the Zoroastrians in the city, and it ultimately incited this angry Christian mob to storm her house on October 21st, 1909, and rip her into the streets and savagely beat her to within an inch of her life. She would survive this lynching, and she would be taken to a hospital where she'd be treated for severe blunt force injuries and lacerations. But after 2 days of being in the hospital, when she had not made a full recovery at all, she checked herself out and headed home. The next day, Ioana was found dead in her apartment, and her family and friends initially believed that she had died as a result of the injuries she had sustained from the angry mob, and that perhaps she had checked herself out of the hospital too soon, and untreated, that's why she must have passed away early. But when the authorities arrived at her house and began looking at the scene, it did not look like she had died as a result of those injuries. It looked more like some sort of ritual suicide. She was laying on this sofa with her arms over her chest. Next to the sofa was an altar that was adorned with strange occult symbols and ritual herbs and effigies, and on the altar was this goblet with deep, dark red stains on the inside. When they looked at Ioana, even though she was fully dressed, underneath her sleeves were all these cuts on her arms, and there were cuts on her legs as well. After her autopsy, the medical examiner said she had died from a combination of blood loss and internal shock from ingesting massive quantities of blood that triggered cardiac arrest. Ioana had been draining her own blood into the sacramental goblet, drinking it, and then doing it over and over again until she died. Locals believed that that was not just a ritual suicide, but rather she was placing a curse on her enemies. Almost immediately following her death, those 2 Christian ministers that had spread those rumors about her that led to the mob coming and attacking her, they both died of an extremely rare blood-borne illness. And then immediately following their demise, the 2 primary vigilantes that actually organized that mob that would attack Ioana, they both died. One was hit by a falling tree and another died in a fire. And according to more recent accounts, Ioana's curse didn't end with the death of her tormentors. There have been dozens of reports of people after seeing an image, which is of Ioana after she was discovered by authorities in her home, that they will have bouts of extreme sleep paralysis. These are people that have never had sleep paralysis before, that this picture somehow induces sleep paralysis in them, like they're cursed by Ioana. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Witching Hour. Just before midnight on August 22nd, 2005, 38-year-old Rick Eck knocked on the front door of an apartment in the tiny Midwestern farm town of Claremont, Illinois. As Rick waited for the door to open, he could barely stand still because he was so excited about what he was going to be doing that night. Finally, the door swung open, and Rick saw right in front of him this very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was Irenia Kottner, and she was 34 years old, and by day, she worked at Walmart, but at night, she became the real version of herself. She was a witch who actually led a group of witches known as a coven that Rick was a part of. Without saying anything, Irenia motioned for Rick to follow her into her apartment, and then Irenia turned and began walking away. And Rick, before stepping over the threshold, he paused for a moment and just turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall, muscular man named David Lindner. And Rick, he just kind of nodded at David, and David nodded back, and then the two of them walked inside. As Rick and David followed Irenia into her apartment, Rick still could barely contain his excitement. He had only joined this coven recently, about a year and a half ago, and so witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. Rick had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies, and so he was hopeful that tonight would go something like Harry Potter. And Rick knew David, the guy he had brought along, was this very powerful warlock, which is a male witch, and so he figured, if David's here, this is bound to go to plan. Rick just hoped he'd be able to keep up with David, or at least play some sort of meaningful support role. Irenia eventually led Rick and David down this dark hallway to this small living room where in the middle of the floor was a ring of lit candles. And as soon as Rick and David stepped into the room with Irenia, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room, and also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irenia had been burning in preparation for tonight's event. Rick, David, and Irenia walked quietly into the middle of this circle of candles, and they sat down cross-legged in a circle facing each other, and then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Claremont was normally very quiet and peaceful. This is a town that literally has more cornfields than people, and Claremont was over 100 miles away from the nearest city. But beneath the calm exterior, Claremont had a dark side. Amongst the 200 or so residents of Claremont were several very dark witches. Not this coven, not Irenia, Rick, and David. They were the good guys. The dark witches, they were kind of out and about in this town and doing bad things, like practicing evil magic and evil witchcraft. And so this coven, led by Irenia, was actually in place to try to combat these evil witches in their midst. And tonight, Rick, David, and Irenia were going to attempt to perform their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt to break a powerful hex, which is kind of like a curse. And this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Claremont, a 16-year-old girl named Lindsay Kassinger. As Rick sat cross-legged in the middle of the circle, he found himself staring at the two slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead center of the circle, that were basically right between Rick, David, and Irenia. And David, as he stared at these two candles, he saw etched in each of the candles' bodies were words. On one candle it said Lindsay, and on the other candle it was etched baby. Because it would turn out this very evil dark witch, Lindsay, was pregnant, and so instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat two, because Lindsay and her baby were kind of intertwined. Now, before this night, the coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lindsay had cast, and the coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Irenia, because Irenia was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love, and so of course that had to be a product of this curse. And as the coven had continued to try and fail at breaking this hex,
The hex had only become more powerful and begun to spread, from Irenia to other witches in this coven who actually were not present this particular night, including a 20-year-old woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. And so that was why, on this night, the coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex, and so that was why Rick had gone out and brought in David, the experienced warlock from St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed he had broken a hex before, and he could do it again for them. As Rick, Irenia, and Dave all sat in the circle, they looked at each other, and then they began chanting in unison to bring out the dead, to join them in the living room right now. And as they began this chant, Rick found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lindsay and Baby on them, and as he stared at the flames dancing across the top of them, Rick started to feel like he was kind of drifting off into a trance-like state. And he knew that based on his prior teachings from Irenia, the leader of this coven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. And then, as Rick is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Irenia begin to talk, but it wasn't her normal voice. It was the slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over and was now speaking through her mouth. And Irenia, in this kind of slow and strange voice, she would tell Rick and David that the curse is still growing. And then she would say something that totally caught Rick by surprise. She said, again in that slow, strange voice, that the hex now was also on Rick and his entire family, and if they didn't break this hex immediately, Rick and his family would all perish. And when Rick heard this, he's still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones. And so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irenia began to say in this strange voice what their plan was for that night to break this hex. Basically, Rick and David were going to perform a sacred ritual, and Irenia, she began to say to the spirits in the room that Rick and David, they were ready, but they needed help. And so after she said this, she went quiet, and so too did Rick and David, and they're all just sitting there kind of waiting for something to happen. And then after about a minute of just total silence, Irenia began to speak again, still in this strange, slow, bizarre voice, but Rick and David knew now it was a different voice coming out of her. Now Irenia was speaking on behalf of the spirit world that was in the room with them. And Irenia, she would say in this voice, "I grant you 5 demons to help you on your quest to break this hex." And then after saying this, Irenia, she opened her eyes and she looked kind of confused for a moment, and then she kind of got her bearings and she looked at David and Rick and she told them now in her normal voice that they had to perform this sacred ritual before the 2 candles in the middle with Lindsay and Baby etched on them burned out. And so basically, Rick and David, they needed to get this done tonight. Then Irenia handed David a sacred tool that would be used that night in this sacred ritual that David and Rick were going to complete. And then Rick and David, they would stand up to leave, and before they left, Irenia would give them the typical witch send-off, which was, "Blessed be." And then Rick and David, they nodded their heads, they turned and walked out of the apartment, and as soon as they were out into the night, Rick could have sworn he saw dark shadows moving around all over the place, and he knew right then and there that he and David would be safe that night, because clearly the shadows moving around had to be those 5 demons that Irenia had called forth from the spirit world to protect them this night. And so feeling very safe and empowered, Rick and David went straight into Rick's car. Rick turned it on and pulled away from the curb and began heading towards their destination. A few miles away, at the house where the 16-year-old evil witch Lindsay Kassinger lived, a 20-year-old Army private named Joshua Bennett was sitting at the kitchen table in Lindsay's house, eating chicken wings and just kind of enjoying his night. Josh didn't know Lindsay very well, but he wasn't at her house to see Lindsay. He was at her house to see his own mother. And Josh and his mother had a lot of catching up to do. She had abandoned him and his father when he was young, and so Josh's dad had raised him. And then when Josh was old enough, he had joined the military, and now he was about to deploy to the Middle East to go to war. But unexpectedly, Josh's father had died, and so Josh had come back to Illinois for the funeral, and it was at the funeral where he saw his mother. She was in attendance as well, and, even though he was upset with his mother for abandoning him, he felt like, I want to reconnect with her. And so he'd gone over and he'd given her a hug, and his mother had been so touched that she had asked Josh to come by her house in Claremont, Illinois, where she lived with her boyfriend, because she really wanted some alone time to actually hear about Josh's life and kind of, get back together again. And so, of course, Josh had said yes, and so here he was at this house in Claremont. Now, Josh had arrived at this house a little bit earlier, and he was surprised to discover that it was not just his mother and her boyfriend living there, but also his mother's boyfriend's son, whose name was Jackie, was also living there, along with his pregnant girlfriend, the evil witch, Lindsay Cassinger. But Josh didn't really mind that there was extra people. It was just maybe a little bit confusing that this was kind of a big roommate situation. But it seemed like Jackie and his girlfriend Lindsay were very nice people, and they quickly went downstairs to the apartment in the basement and kind of just stayed out of the way so Josh and his mother could catch up. And so after Josh finished eating his wings, his mother came into the kitchen, and the two of them chatted for hours, and then finally, at about midnight that night, Josh decided to go to bed, so he said goodnight to his mom, he retreated to the bedroom, and he laid in bed. But he couldn't really sleep right away, because he had a lot going on in his life. I mean, he had just lost his dad a couple of weeks ago, and then at the same time, he had reconnected with his estranged mother, and he's about to deploy to Iraq, to a war zone, and, he felt ready for that, but at the same time, he was kind of apprehensive, it's about to happen, I hope I'll be able to do my job. And so with all these kind of intense thoughts swirling around his head, he just kind of laid there and didn't really expect to sleep anytime soon. But eventually, Josh did fall asleep. However, it felt like he had only been asleep for a couple of minutes when he was abruptly woken up by the sound of barking coming out from the kitchen. Jackie's dog was going crazy. And so Josh grabbed his phone and he checked the time and saw it was 3 a.m. And so instead of going out there and dealing with this dog, he just thought, it's going to stop eventually. And so Josh grabbed his pillow and he put it over his head and tried to muffle the sounds so he could fall back asleep. But it didn't work. The dog just kept on barking. And then when Josh took the pillow off his head and kind of sat up wondering what he should do about this dog situation, he heard the sound of a man's voice, a stranger's voice, saying, "I bring you forth from the dark." And then after Josh heard this, he heard the sound of a woman screaming, and it sounded like his mom. And so acting on instinct, Josh leapt from his bed, he ran out of the room, and he goes into the kitchen, and he sees the dog is jumping and barking and going mad, and his mom is screaming, and there's this guy grabbing her, kind of grappling with her, who's wearing black gloves and a ski mask, and there's another guy next to him with the same getup. It's absolute chaos. But before Josh could run over and save his mother, suddenly his chest felt like it was on fire, and then he went blind, and his eyes had this burning pain in them, and then he couldn't breathe, and he was stumbling backwards, barely able to stand. Minutes later, Rick, who was one of the witches from the coven, bolted out of the front door of Lindsay's house where all this chaos was happening, and he just took off running across the street directly into a cornfield. And as he ran, he felt this throbbing pain in his leg, and he could feel blood pooling in his shoe. Rick ran until he couldn't run any farther, and then he collapsed onto the ground, and then he began thinking about what an absolute disaster it had been inside of the evil witch's house. Not only had they failed to break the hex cast by Lindsay, but also Rick was concerned that David, his partner, who was still at the house, was dead. And Rick, he began looking around wildly, hoping all those demons that were sent to help them from the spirit world, he was hoping they'd be nearby and they'd know what to do. But Rick looked around and there was no one. So Rick thought for a second, oh my gosh, Lindsay's hex must be stronger than any of us realize. We have to do something now. We have to end this before me and my family get killed too. And so Rick pulled out his phone and he called Irenia, the leader of the coven, to get her advice about what they should do next. But Irenia didn't respond to what Rick was saying the way he expected her to. Instead, she seemed very cold and almost enraged at what he was saying. And then, before Rick could kind of figure out what was going on with Irenia, he heard off in the distance the sound of sirens making their way to the evil witch's house. Over the next few days, police detectives would speak to everyone inside of Irenia's coven, as well as everyone who knew both Irenia and Lindsay. And slowly but surely, the police would put together what actually happened inside of Lindsay, the evil witch's house, in the early morning hours of August 23rd, 2005. At about 3 a.m. on August 23rd, 2005, Rick and David pulled up onto Lindsay's street and they parked their car a little ways away from Lindsay's house. And then after parking, Rick and David donned their ski masks and their gloves. And then after looking at each other and nodding, they hopped out and began walking towards Lindsay's house. Their plan was to sneak in through one of Lindsay's windows and confront Lindsay the evil witch directly and break the hex by performing a sacred ritual. And then after this ritual was over, they had a second ritual they would need to perform that would send Lindsay's evil soul through the gates of hell. And to do that, they needed the help of the 5 demons that had been sent along by Irenia from the spirit world. Now, Rick and David felt like this was a great plan. However, as soon as they got to Lindsay's house and David actually began trying to climb into one of the windows, everything fell apart. First, the dog began to bark inside of Lindsay's house, and that alerted Josh's mother, who came into the kitchen and sees the dog and sees David falling through the window. And Rick, who didn't really know what was happening inside the house, he just climbed through the window after David, and when he stood up in the kitchen, he realized it was too late. They were totally caught. And so Rick, not really knowing what to do, he's seeing all this yelling and chaos happening. He looks over at David, and he sees David grab something from his belt, and he pulls it out. And it was the tool that Irenia had given them when they left her apartment to go carry out this sacred ritual. This tool was part of that sacred ritual, and it was a long, sharp knife. And what they were going to do is stab the evil witch, Lindsay Kassinger, to death with it. That was how they were going to break the hex. And then after they killed Lindsay, they were going to perform this weird ritual with her clothing that would send her soul through the gates of hell. Now, Rick did understand that this was the plan. They were going to murder Lindsay, but perhaps he didn't really know how serious David was about carrying it out, or the fact that David was not really a warlock as much as he was a violent criminal who had bragged to Irenia about previously murdering someone who had cast a separate hex. And so by killing this person, that was how David had broken the hex previously. Also, Rick may not have known that David had been instructed by Irenia to not let anything stand in their way to break this hex, to carry out this sacred ritual on Lindsay. And so Rick just watched as David raised the knife and began stabbing Josh's mother over and over again in the chest while screaming, "I bring you forth from the dark." And it was at this point that Josh, the army private who heard all this happening, came charging out in his underwear into the kitchen, and Rick watched as David went from stabbing Josh's mother to turning and immediately stabbing Josh directly in the chest. And Rick, at this point, he just jumped right in on it and pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed Josh in the eyes. And so that was why Josh felt the burning sensation and then went blind and couldn't breathe and fell to the ground. And so now it is absolutely chaos inside of this kitchen, and the actual target of David and Rick's, Lindsay, the evil witch, she managed to run out of the house and run to a nearby neighbor's house to get help. Meanwhile, the evil witch's boyfriend, Jackie, he comes upstairs carrying a shotgun. And at this point, Josh is on the ground, clearly dying from the stab wound to his chest. His mother as well is struggling on the ground. And David is going totally nuts, saying all these strange things and whipping his knife around. And Rick is just totally panicking and doesn't know what to do. And so when Jackie ran at Rick with this shotgun, Rick pulled out his own knife and attempted to stab Jackie, but somehow missed Jackie and stabbed himself in the leg. And so that was why his leg was throbbing and bleeding, because he had stabbed himself. And then after Rick had stabbed himself, Jackie just walked over and Spartan kicked Rick down the stairs into the basement. And then Jackie turned his attention from Rick to David, who was still just going nuts with this knife and being a total maniac. And Jackie just walked over to David, and David, he sees the shotgun coming over to him, and he tries to move the barrel out of the way, but then somehow only manages to point the gun directly at his own stomach, at which point Jackie just fired a slug directly into David's gut. And it was at this moment, as David is crumpling to the ground with this horrible stomach wound, that the neighbor that Lindsay, the evil witch, had gone to go get, had come to the house. They went inside, and they found a scene of absolute carnage. And before the neighbor could even do anything, Rick, who had stabbed himself in the leg and been kicked down into the basement, had scrambled up the steps and just run right past all the bodies on the ground, past the neighbor who didn't even do anything, outside, and Rick just kept on running out into that cornfield. And so at this point, the neighbor didn't even try to figure out what happened. He just called 911. But it was already too late for Josh, the army private, who was only at this house to reconnect with his estranged mother before he deployed to Iraq. And here he was, dead on the ground from this totally bizarre attack. It would turn out Rick, David, and really the entire coven of witches that fell under Irenia had been totally duped. They all fully believed that Lindsay was in fact an evil witch who had cast this hex on Irenia, which was spreading to all the other members of the coven. But in reality, Irenia, the leader of this coven, she didn't believe there was a hex. That had nothing to do with any of this. The whole coven thing was totally made up. She was just jealous that Lindsay was dating Jackie. Irenia had previously dated Jackie and they had broken up, and Irenia still wanted to get back together, but Jackie didn't. And so now that Jackie was with Lindsay, Irenia just couldn't handle it. And so, naturally, Irenia had constructed this whole thing about Lindsay being one of the dark witches in Claremont, Illinois, and she's cast this hex, and now you, my witches in this coven, you need to go and kill her. But, of course, Lindsay did not end up getting killed, and instead, it was the totally innocent person, Josh, the army private, who had nothing to do with any of this, who got killed. In addition to Josh dying, David, the warlock from St. Louis, he died from the shotgun blast to his stomach, and then Josh's mother, who had been stabbed repeatedly by David, she would actually survive her attack. Irenia would ultimately be found guilty of first-degree murder, and she would be sentenced to 57 years in prison. Rick pleaded guilty to murder as well, and he was sentenced to 20 years, and a third member of the coven, who was not present for the attack, but who after the fact helped cover it up, they were sentenced to 32 years in prison.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the Mr. Ballin podcast, and also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So,